Hello everyone, I'm Melvin from Creative Now. In today's video, I'd like to share with you on how to effectively use data validation in Google Sheets. And of course, we can create a drop-down list out of these data validation functions. In this video as well, I'm going to share with you on how to create a dynamic drop-down list and even a dependent drop-down list. So let's get started. So in Google Drive, let's create a new sheet. And let me rename it. Okay, great. To use the data validation function, click on the data menu and click on data validations. So inside this data validation functions, there's a few ways to validate your data inside your Google Sheets cell. So inside this function, there's a few things to set. The first one would be the cell range. So which of the cell that you would like to implement this data validation? Is it a single cell, or is it a row, a column, or a specific range of cell? The next thing would be the criteria. What would be the criteria for this cell to be validated? And you can select a few settings out of it, and I'll come back to this later. And the next one will be on invalid data. So in this setting, you are required to select either to show warning when user input an invalid data, or rejecting the input whenever user input an invalid data. And of course, the last one would be the appearance. So when you click on the checkbox for this show validation help text, you are required to enter some wordings about how you like user to change their input whenever they input an invalid data. So I will not go even deep down towards this appearance. You can try it yourself. So let's try to make a data validation on this A1 cell. And the first one would be numbers. So you can validate your cell input with the criteria numbers. So whenever user input, they'll need to match your criteria. So for numbers, you can select a few selections. So you can put a number between, or number not between, number less than, greater than, equal or not equal to. So for example, if you are going to put a cell selections or cell input that inputs a user's age. So for user's age, we will usually put 1 to 100 or 120. Because this is the valid age number, and out of this range, it will not be valid. So let's try on putting the show warning on invalid data. Okay, so whenever you input any numbers between 1 to 120, it should be fine. But if you put any value out of this range, then you'll see a little triangle on the top right. And whenever you hover towards this cell, it will show you invalid. Input must be according to the settings that you have set. So any value out of that range, you will have this little red triangle. This is what we call show warnings on invalid data. And let's try on the other one. Okay, if we change it to reject input, it means that whenever user input invalid data, it will directly reject you without allowing users to input. So for example, if I inputting a valid data, then it should be working as usual. And if I'm going to input an invalid data, then Google Sheets will directly reject my input. So you will not be able to input those invalid data. So that's the difference between show warning and reject input. Next, I'd like to talk about text criteria. So in text criteria, you can select different types that user must input the text. So for example, you can select that this cell must contain what wordings, for example, approve. So if we put that the wordings that needed inside this cell, whenever user type approve wording inside, then it will be function as normal. But if user didn't type the approved wordings, then you will have error. And as the same as the one number, show warning will need show warnings, and when you select reject input, then it will directly reject your input. So you can see the warning is coming out whenever I don't have the approved wordings. So instead of contain, you can select different one. For example, does not contain. So whenever this is selected, Google Sheets will make sure that the cell inside your data validation cell range does not contain what sorts of word that you have set. And that's also equal is a valid email, means that user must input the correct email format into the cell. Or is a valid URL, if it's a valid URL is set, then user must input the correct URL structure into this cell. Okay, moving on, let's look at the date. So for the date validation, you can have different kind of settings. For example, it's a valid date. So whenever this is set, the Google Sheets data validation function will make sure that user input a correct date format into the cell. And you can set different kind of stuff, like make sure the date is equal to which day, or is it before or after, or even between or not between this date. So this is kind of different settings for date data validations. And here comes the list of items and list from a range, which we use it more frequently. So I'll talk about this list of items first. So for list of items, you can input a list whenever you wish user to select, and this list will show in a drop-down list in a cell if you tick this checkbox. So for example, if you wish user to input project status, then you could have a list of different status. For example, you could have a completed status, and maybe ongoing, and also urgent. So these are all the lists that you have. So whenever I save, you can see that a drop-down list with the arrow is shown. So user can select out of it. And if you did not select the reject input, user could still input any kind of wordings with the error. So if you don't wish user to put in any information or text or wordings out of this list that you have set, then make sure you click on the reject input. So whenever user input anything out of this, they will have problem input. Okay, great. So this is an example of using list of items. And now coming to list from a range, this is the best function for Google Sheets because you can create a lot of stuff using this range. So for example, if you wish to create a dynamic list of range that this cell will be referencing, then this is the functions. Okay, so let me show you. If I have a list of employee and I wish to associate them to each and every projects that my company have. So let me create a list of employee. Okay, great. So inside this data validation, I'll need to select list from a range and click on this, and you can select the employee list. And after that, you will get your employee list as the drop-down list. And the good part of this is that whenever you have you changes any data from the range, then the drop-down list will dynamically change as well. So for example, maybe for Alan, I'm changing to Mary. So you can see that the list changes as well. There's no longer Alan and it has changed to Mary. The bad part about this is that whenever you change your data the cell that you are validating will not automatically change. So whenever you change the original value to a new value, the cell will remain the original, and if it is not part of the list, then you will see the error message pop up, even with the reject input set. So you will need to manually change it. So that's quite a disadvantage for these settings. And moving forward, if you are looking at adding more lists to your employee, I would suggest you to, instead of putting D2 cell to D5, I would suggest you to put the whole column, so that whenever you input a new employee inside, then you have the list drop-down list automatically updated. Okay, great. So next, if we are unchecking this show drop-down list in cell, you will be making the same as previous data validation format, just that the arrow is not there and user can input if you put on show warnings. If you are setting the reject input, then user will not be able to input the invalid data. So it's still the same, just that the cell will not have this small arrow beside the cell. Okay, next, let me tick that. Next, if you are going to validate the whole column of the cell, make sure to include the whole column. And when you press save, you see that the column A will be validated. Each and every cell in column A will be validated. So moving forward, let me share with you how to create a dynamically and dependent drop-down list. So let me clear everything out of it. Okay, great. So imagine I have a list of selection 1 and 2. So my idea is that whenever I select selection 1, the selection 2 will be dynamically changed depending on my selection 1. So let me set it. So for selection 2, selection 1, I will have 1, 2, and 3. This is an example. So for selection 2, I will have 1A, 1B, okay. So for my selection 1, I'll just input as normal. So I'll put on the data validation just below the selection 1, this from a range, and here we'll put the whole A column. So I'll reject input. So you can see that it's 1, 2, 3. And for selection 2, what I'm trying to do is whenever I input 1, I'll need to make sure that 1A, 1B, or 1C is shown in selection 2. And whenever I input 2, 2A, 2B, and 2C is shown in selection 2. So this is kind of dependent drop-down list selections. So how to do that? So we'll need to use some formula to help on building this dynamically changes filter. So the first function I'd like to share with you is filter. So this filter function will help to filter out all the conditions that you have set from a list of data. So I'm trying to filter the whole B column. And next, I'd like to share with you that I'm building the condition using regex match formula. So this regex match formula is kind of complex, but in this example, it helps us to get the alphabet or the pattern out from the original one. So for example, I'm matching the whole B with my selection 1, B2. So whenever I select 1, it will come out with 1 A, B, C, 2 A, B, C. So when I have this dynamically changed selection, then my selection 2 will be very much easier. So I just put a list from range, and there you go, you have the same thing. So whenever I change my selection 1, my selection 2 will drop-down list will change as well. And in this example, I even can change the whole format. Like for example, when I select A or B or C, so when I select A, it should come out 1A, 2A, 3A. When I select B, it should come out 1B, 2B, and 3B. So if I change like this, then you can see that everything changes, the whole structure changes. So it can be done like this as well. This is how a dependent drop-down list, dependent dynamically changed drop-down list can be used in Google Sheets. And you can even move this data validation out from the same sheets. So let me create a new sheet and put it in. So you can even move it out of this list. Make sure that your list of range refer to the correct column. So these are the correct. So it should be referring to the sheet 1. Okay, right. And your selection 2 filter, instead of make sure that it's pointing to the right cell, which is cell A2. So that's the correct information. So when you put it in another sheet, it still works the same. So it still works perfectly, and you can even hide this sheet 1 so that people will not be able to look at the settings, or it will simplify those users' experience. And lastly, let me show you what is custom formula in data validation. So this custom formula allows you to set a lot of different settings or different validation out from the normal one. Like for example, if you have column A as a cell volume and column B for a target, and you want those targets to be more than column A, then you can use custom formula to set. In this example, I'd like to show you about how do I make sure that my column F, the number of wordings in column F is more than the number of wording in a cell in column B. Let me input my formula. So I'm using length as the formula. So this length formula helps to get the length of the alphabet in a cell. So I'm getting the length F. So I'm making sure that the length of alphabet in cell F should be more than the number of alphabet in cell B. Okay, let's try it out. So make sure if you are looking to implement the whole cell, make sure that your cell range, the whole column, make sure that your cell range is set to this. Okay, so if I input the same number, and it should show error. So if I input one more character, then it should be fine. Same goes to 3A. So if I input the actual number of digits or number of character in cell column B, then it should show error. And if I input an additional one, then it should be working fine. So this is one of the examples that you can use custom formula for data validations. So that's all for today's video. I hope you enjoy and learn it, and you can use it in your daily life or work. And I'll see you on the next episode.